Hello, class. My name is Tyler Jenke. I am a PhD of History student at Liberty University, and for this course, the class that I have been creating is an undergraduate Missouri history course. And within that module, the presentation I'm going to have for you is called Decisions Made by President Truman. And so I am from Missouri, Central Missouri. That's where I currently reside. I've always been fascinated by Truman. He is the only president that hails from our state, and so I've always been fascinated by him. And so within that course, we look at President Truman and specifically some of his major decisions, sometimes controversial decisions of his time as president. And so, as you can see on the screen, we're going to be talking about ending World War II, use of the atomic bomb, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and then desegregating the military. And so So the first decision that we're going to look at with President Truman is ending World War II. And so he took office just 4 months into being vice president. And it isn't like today where whenever you start to transition or you become vice president that you share all of the information that's out there. That wasn't the case. FDR really kept Truman in the dark. And so then when Truman became president, he had a lot of catching up to do. And with that came the discovery of nuclear weapons, the fact that we had been developing in secret nuclear weapons for a long time. And so by the time he takes over, the nuclear weapons are really being developed, and then as he's starting to go overseas to the Potsdam Conference and things like that, or the Yalta Conference, he is hearing reports that their tests are going well and things like that. And so he has a clear decision to make at this particular moment, and that is, does he go ahead with the plans to invade the mainland of Japan, island hopping into workday, or does he use this weapon? And the two sides of this decision, kind of have pros and cons. So the first side, invading Japan, is that you are focused on military personnel. It's military versus military. Yes, civilians get in line, but that's not the focus. The problem is that his experts were telling him whether they were giving him false information because they wanted to use the atomic bomb. They're telling him that it was potentially going to be close to 1 million soldiers estimated dying in the conflict because the Japanese simply were not giving up. The other side was dropping the atomic bomb. Now, they were also telling him that they're going to use certain sites that are strategic, that haven't been touched, and things like that, and that civilians would die. And so Truman had this decision to make. Does he use this weapon that's brand new, that's extremely destructive, focusing on, yes, military personnel, but also civilians, or does he worry about American lives? And so really what it comes down to for Truman, if you really read into him, is that he knew that he had being commander-in-chief of the military, he had a sense of connection to the military. He knew he had to protect his soldiers. It had been a long war, and they were telling him 1 million more lives in another 2 years, and people were exhausted. And so Truman decides to drop the first bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, August 6, 1945. Before that, there had been a little bit of controversy as to whether he should warn the Japanese or not. He says essentially that you need to surrender, or we will provide destruction that's never seen before. Well, the Japanese just assumed it was landing and fighting and things like that. Well, they didn't. After August 6th, they did not surrender. So in Nagasaki, Japan, August 9th, 3 days later, 1945, they dropped the second bomb. And just as destructive, it devastated cities like we've never seen. There are people who physically disappeared off this planet because they were so close to the bomb that they evaporated. And so because of that, we had more available. We knew we were willing to use them, even though Truman was really reluctant to. But the Japanese surrendered shortly after. So this decision kind of haunted Truman after the war. How could he target civilians? How could he just go after women and kids and things like that? And Truman never relents. Like, he typically, when you read into this decision, there'd be a little bit of regret there, and I'd say personally maybe there was, but anytime he spoke about it, he knew as president that it was the right decision in his mind in order to keep American soldiers safe. And so decision was controversial. It launches us into the nuclear age. The Soviets and even the Germans, before they collapsed, had inkling the Soviets had spies in our factories and things like that, feeding information to back home, but they were still well behind. And so this showed that what our capabilities were, and it launches us into the nuclear age. Second decision I want to look at with you guys is the Truman Doctrine. And so after the war, Truman has another decision to make. Europe had been ravaged. It had been completely, especially central part of Europe and Eastern Europe, had been destroyed. And during the war, the Soviets were our biggest ally. Well, after the war, they did not like, and even at some of the conferences that Truman and Stalin met at, Truman could tell that, yeah, the Soviets were the friend during the war, but pretty quickly after, they're going to spread their ideology. They're going to try to get it as far and as wide as possible. And Truman simply did not want that. Simply did not believe that was the right way to go. And Truman, being also a student of history, look back after World War I, the war that he fought in himself. Like, he's a veteran of the war. Saw that what happens when you just punish countries. Well, you get the Hitlers, you get the Mussolinis, you get these types of people who are going to take over and be destructive, be oppressive, be authoritarian. And so Truman decides to take a different approach, particularly focused on keeping communism from spreading. And so the Truman Doctrine is implemented. And so massive economic assistance to a devastated Europe. And really this was to rebuild Europe in a way to keep communism at bay. And then beyond that, Truman made it his goal to keep communism where it's at. Simply keep it where it's at. It's in Russia, some satellite countries. Okay, we're going to just keep it there. We're not going to allow it to spread. And so what's amazing is that this guy who's from rural Missouri, very rural Missouri, multiple failed businesses before getting into politics through the Pendergast machine, not college educated, came up with the guiding foreign policy principle that for the 20th century. Every president after him, from Eisenhower all the way to George H.W. Bush, practices a form of the Truman Doctrine as a way to keep the Soviets at bay, and that we must at all costs keep them at bay. And so, to me, that is fascinating that somebody from such a humble background is able to create that guiding policy for some of the brightest men after him to adhere to. The next decision kind of comes through that, and that is with the Marshall Plan. And so within that economic assistance, Truman tasks General Marshall with actually implementing this policy, meaning that he wants you to actually send the money, send the resources, send the bulldozers, send the concrete, the steel, construction workers, the wood, the shingles, anything that they need to rebuild Europe as quickly as possible. Get them back on their feet. And if they do that, then democracy can simply reign true. And it works fantastically well. Now, the caveat to that, though, is that between the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan is two things. One, it's very expensive. We are spending our money, our tax dollars, our nation's resources on that. They viewed it as, if we can set Europe back up, that's going to be an excellent trading partner. So we're going to make that money back. And we're going to make sure they make payments back and things like that. But the other side of that is the deteriorating relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. This map right here shows how the Soviet Union, really the winning forces of World War II, broke apart Germany. And you see a large section that's in the green, that's British. You see the French there, kind of on the outer edges. You also see the American sector, and then the red sector, the Soviet sector, is particularly interesting because the capital of Berlin, once this Nazi symbol, but still a powerful city in Europe that's so needed, was also broke apart in the same manner, but falls completely within the Soviet section. And so this, causes even more tension. Not only has Truman and Marshall and all of these American leaders said, we are going to rebuild Europe for the purpose of preserving and expanding democracy. Okay? So they've made it known. They've told the Soviet Union this is exactly what we're going to do. That causes the Soviets to push back. And it leads to certain issues that were potentially going to boil over. The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan really is what kicks off the Cold War. With that though, a lot of people were worried that it was going to turn into a hot war, and some people argued that the Korean War is when it became hot. But this tension, because of Truman being is forward as he was, as blunt as he was with his mindset here, and what his intentions were, it did increase that tension, creating the Cold War, and especially creating moments of tension with the Berlin airlift and other things like that. The final decision that I want to talk with you guys about is Executive Order 9981. And so we're bringing it back domestic right now. This is one of the most important decisions in Truman's presidency. And it's his Executive Order in 1948 to desegregate the military. Now, this is particularly interesting because this is before Rosa Parks, and this is before Dr. King. This is before all of these civil rights leaders end up, becoming what the civil rights movement became. Truman, the controversy behind Truman is that he, in his younger age, was a deeply racist man. I've been to the Truman Library and Museum and read some of his diary articles from when he was a younger man, when he was trying to court Bess, his wife, where he talked very negatively about African Americans. And so over time, obviously, that changed. And really, if you read into Truman and his diary and things like that, what changes for him is that he fought in World War I and saw black veterans coming home and not being treated right. And then when he is president and the war ends, World War II, another massive conflict, black soldiers are coming home. They don't have access to, Greyhound buses and things like that because things are segregated. They're going home in the deep South, Mississippi, Alabama. They're going home in the back of military trucks. And what's happening is that the KKK, which was very active, were stopping these veterans of war coming home after fighting in Europe and Japan and the Pacific, fighting this war, coming home, having their trucks emptied out and being beaten and even killed for simply being black. These are veterans of war that are getting treated terribly by people who never stepped foot in Europe. I mean, some of them did, but that still doesn't make it right. Like, that is the turning point in Truman's racial legacy. Now, you can argue he changed before that, but that was really the moment that made him say, no, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. 1948 was an election year, and Truman was not doing very well. He'd already alienated the Southern Democrats, the part of the party that he really needed. The Republicans, if Thomas Dewey had simply campaigned more, he would have easily won. But the thing is he thought he had it in the bag because the Democratic Party split. And Truman, he decided to go on the offensive. And so what he decided to do was go on what became famous as the Whistle Stop Tour. Tens of thousands of miles in the train, speaking with anybody that he could possibly listen to, that would want to listen to. And he has the greatest upset of all, really one of the greatest upsets of political history. And it almost didn't happen because of this controversial decision. Many told him, no, wait till after the election. But Truman couldn't do that. He couldn't live with that on his conscience. He said, if this loses the election for him, so be it. I've done what is right. And so that is fascinating. Truman was a very simple thinker. He tried to see in black and white what is right and what is wrong in his mind. He used his moral compass, his faith, and Bess to guide his decisions throughout his entire presidency. Thank you guys very much for listening. See you soon.